The world had barely begun to breathe after the devastation of the Second World War, when new tensions began to shape the global landscape. Cities lay in ruins, economies shattered, and millions of lives uprooted. Yet, amid the rubble, two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood at the dawn of a conflict that would shape the next half-century. This was not a war of armies clashing on open fields, but a war of ideologies, espionage, and the looming shadow of nuclear annihilation. It was the Cold War. In February 1945, at the Grand Halls of Yalta, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to discuss the fate of post-war Europe. Maps were spread across the table, voices tense with urgency. Decisions made in these rooms would draw lines across the continent, shaping nations and sowing seeds of suspicion. The Soviet Union, emerging from the horrors of the Nazi invasion, demanded security and influence in Eastern Europe. The United States and Britain, war-weary yet determined, sought to contain this expansion, planting the early roots of an ideological divide. Months later, Winston Churchill would famously warn of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. His words resonated across the West, articulating the invisible wall that divided freedom from oppression, democracy from authoritarianism. The stage was set, and the tension between East and West began to crystallize. In 1947, President Truman issued the Truman Doctrine, pledging support for nations resisting communist encroachment. Greece and Turkey became the first test cases, and the message was clear. The United States would stand firm against the spread of Soviet influence. Soon after, the Marshall Plan poured aid into a Europe desperate for rebuilding, sending ships, trains, and planes full of food, machinery, and hope. Yet, as Europe rose again, the shadow of mistrust deepened. By 1948, the city of Berlin became the first battlefield of the Cold War. Soviet forces blockaded the western sectors of the city, aiming to starve the Allies out. In response, the Western powers launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in supplies through clouds and storm, sustaining millions of Berliners and defying Soviet pressure. The standoff would last nearly a year, proving that this conflict would be fought with strategy, ingenuity, and unyielding resolve. The formation of NATO in 1949 formalized a Western alliance against potential Soviet aggression. Meanwhile, in a secretive desert test site, the Soviets successfully detonated their first atomic bomb, shattering the American monopoly on nuclear weapons. The balance of power had shifted, and the threat of mutual destruction now loomed over every decision made by both nations. In the early 1950s, Korea became the first hot war in this cold conflict. North Korean forces, backed by the Soviets and Chinese, crossed to the 38th parallel into South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened to defend the South. The conflict raged through mountains and rivers, with devastating consequences, leaving a divided peninsula that remains tense to this day. At home, America was gripped by fear. McCarthyism spread like wildfire, as accusations of communist infiltration took hold in government, entertainment, and everyday life. Lives were ruined by suspicion, and the battle for hearts and minds was not just overseas, it was within the very fabric of society. The space race began as both nations sought to demonstrate technological and ideological superiority. In 1957, the Soviet launch of Sputnik orbiting Earth stunned the world. The United States scrambled to catch up, sending satellites, rockets, and eventually astronauts into the skies, transforming the heavens into a new arena of competition. By the mid-1950s, revolts in Eastern Europe, like the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, revealed the harsh realities of Soviet control. Protesters clashed with tanks. Defiance met with ruthless suppression. The world watched, aware that the ideological divide was not abstracted, was enforced with force, fear, and an unwavering grip on power. In 1960, the U-2 spy plane incident heightened tensions further. An American aircraft was shot down over Soviet territory, exposing the shadow war of espionage that had quietly intensified. Diplomacy faltered, suspicions deepened, and the specter of confrontation grew ever closer. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Soviet missiles were discovered just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. President Kennedy faced the most perilous days of his presidency, navigating a blockade, tense negotiations, and the constant fear that a single misstep could trigger a nuclear holocaust. After tense deliberations, the Soviets withdrew their missiles, narrowly averting disaster. The crisis left a permanent mark on the collective consciousness, a stark reminder of the stakes of this ideological struggle. Berlin remained a focal point. In 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall physically embodied the divide, separating families, neighbors, and a city itself. Yet, the conflict extended far beyond Europe. Vietnam became the next proxy, as American and Soviet influence fueled a brutal war that would claim millions of lives and haunt generations. The 1970s brought a period of détente. Leaders from Washington and Moscow met in summits, shaking hands, negotiating arms reductions, and cautiously reducing tensions. Yet, even as diplomacy advanced, the world remained shadowed by the potential for catastrophe. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan reignited tensions. Tanks rolled through rugged mountains, guerrilla fighters resisted, and the United States provided covert support, prolonging the conflict and draining resources. The Cold War's reach extended into every corner of the globe, shaping nations. Far from the capitals of Moscow and Washington, President Reagan, in 1983, labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire, signaling a renewed ideological confrontation. Ambitious initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, sought to challenge the balance of power in unprecedented ways, using technology and imagination to deter nuclear war. By 1989, the world witnessed one of the most iconic moments of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall. East and West Berliners tore down the barriers that had divided their city for decades. A symbolic triumph of hope, unity, and resilience. The crumbling wall foreshadowed the collapse of the Soviet Union, which would formally occur in 1991. The end of the Cold War did not erase its legacy. Nuclear shadows lingered, espionage networks remained, and the ideological divide left scars on societies across the globe. Proxy wars, media battles, and the constant threat of annihilation had shaped a generation, leaving lessons on the fragility of peace and the value of diplomacy today. As we look back on those decades, we see a world that stood at the edge of collapse, yet survived through caution, negotiation, and the resilience of humanity. The Cold War was a story of fear and hope, of shadows cast by nuclear weapons, and of the enduring struggle between competing visions of the world. Its lessons echo through history, reminding us that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit can find a way to endure. The year was 1945. Europe lay in ruins, a continent scarred by years of brutal conflict. Cities that had once thrummed with life were now reduced to rubble. Streets were strewn with debris, and skeletal buildings cast long shadows across deserted squares. The smell of smoke and destruction lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the war that had consumed millions of lives. Amid this devastation, nations struggled to rebuild. Millions of displaced people wandered across borders, searching for food, shelter, and a sense of safety that seemed increasingly elusive. Yet, even as Europe attempted to heal, a new tension quietly took hold. Two powers, rising from the ashes of victory, began to look at the world and each other with suspicion. The United States, emerging as the planet's preeminent economic and military force sought stability and the spread of democratic ideals. Its leaders envisioned a world rebuilt on free markets, alliances, and the principles of liberal democracy. Across the continent, the Soviet Union, having endured the unimaginable horrors of the Nazi invasion, emerged with immense human and material losses, yet also with a sense of hard-earned power. Stalin and his inner circle believed that the future security of the USSR depended on creating a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, ensuring that no foreign army could ever again invade Russian soil. In city streets across Berlin, Warsaw, and Prague, the presence of soldiers from both the United States and the Soviet Union was tangible and intimidating. Uniforms of different colors, accents of different languages, and the silent tension between patrols reminded civilians that the war had not truly ended. It had merely transformed. Behind closed doors, diplomats and generals debated the future of a fragile Europe. The Allies had achieved victory, but they were united only by their opposition to the Axis. Now, competing visions for the post-war order began to emerge. While Roosevelt envisioned cooperation, Stalin demanded security and influence, and Churchill feared the spread of Soviet authoritarianism like a creeping shadow across the continent. The world had entered a precarious period. The bullets had stopped flying, but the battles had not. The seeds of the Cold War were quietly being sown amidst the rubble, shadows stretching across cities, borders, and the hearts of nations. In February 1945, the world's fate seemed to hinge on the discussions held at Yalta, a resort city on the Crimean Peninsula. The war in Europe was nearing its end, yet the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin gathered in solemn consultation. The air inside the grand halls was thick with the weight of history. Maps of Europe were spread across tables, showing a continent carved by war and desperate for reconstruction. Every decision carried consequences that would ripple across decades. The leaders debated the division of Germany, the establishment of the United Nations, and the fate of liberated nations. Roosevelt, aging and frail, pressed for a vision of cooperation and post-war stability. Churchill, with his sharp wit and iron will, argued for caution and the containment of Soviet influence. Stalin, determined and unyielding, demanded security for the USSR, asserting control over Eastern Europe as non-negotiable. Behind the dignified facades, tension simmered. Every handshake, every exchange of documents carried the weight of suspicion. What emerged from Yalta would lay the foundation for the ideological battles to come. The division of Europe into spheres of influence, though framed as pragmatic, would later be seen as the first act in a global chess match between East and West. The world watched as Winston Churchill, the indomitable British leader who had guided his nation through the darkest hours of World War II, took the stage in Fulton, Missouri. In March 1946, the hall was filled with dignitaries, politicians, journalists, and an expectant audience. The war had ended less than a year prior, yet the threat of conflict lingered not in the form of tanks or battleships, but in the invisible, creeping tension between two superpowers. Churchill spoke with gravitas, his voice carrying the weight of history and the urgency of warning. He described a continent divided, where freedom and tyranny faced off in a silent yet pervasive struggle. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he said, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Europe, though physically free from Nazi occupation, was now politically fractured. Eastern Europe had fallen under the influence of the Soviet Union, with puppet governments installed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond. The Western nations, though victorious, faced an uncertain future. Churchill's words resonated across the Atlantic and beyond. The war had ended, but a new, subtler conflict was beginning. The speech illuminated the ideological divide. Democracy versus communism, liberty versus control. It emphasized the reality that the battle lines were no longer drawn on maps of cities and territories, but in the hearts and minds of nations. The Iron Curtain was both literal and metaphorical, a boundary that would dictate political alliances, military strategies, and global diplomacy for decades to come. Across Europe, citizens looked at the world around them with uncertainty. Families divided by shifting borders, economies struggling to recover, and governments reshaped under external influence so bore witness to the new tension. The Iron Curtain was not just a political concept. It was a looming presence, a shadow, over the hopes of millions who had survived one war only to confront the specter of another. In Washington, the speech reverberated through the corridors of power. The United States recognized the growing challenge. The Soviet Union was no longer a wartime ally, but a potential adversary. Policymakers began to consider strategies of containment, aid, and military readiness. The seeds of what would later be called the Cold War were now firmly planted, and the world stood at the threshold of an era defined by suspicion, preparation, and the ever-present possibility of conflict. The Iron Curtain was drawn not with bricks or mortar, but with ideology, influence, and fear. And as Churchill's words echoed across continents, it became clear the Cold War was not a distant threat. It was already here. In March 1947, the world witnessed a defining moment in the early Cold War. President Harry S. Truman, standing in the Grand Chamber of the United States Congress, addressed a nation still recovering from the devastation of global conflict. The speech he delivered would set the tone for decades of American foreign policy, laying the groundwork for a strategy that sought to contain Soviet influence wherever it threatened freedom. Europe was fragile. Greece teetered on the edge of civil war, its people weary from years of occupation and resistance. Turkey faced pressure from Soviet ambitions in the strategic Dardanelles. Both nations were vulnerable, and Truman recognized that the United States could not afford to remain passive. In his address, he articulated a new principle. The U.S. would provide political, military, and economic assistance to countries resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Support for free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, Truman declared, is the policy of the United States. His words marked a turning point. No longer would America retreat into isolation following the Second World War. Instead, it would actively project its influence, defending democracy as a bulwark against the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine was more than a policy statement. It was a promise. It meant that the United States would commit resources, personnel, and strategic planning to nations under threat, signaling a clear line in the ideological sand. Aid flowed into Greece and Turkey, almost immediately military advisors' supplies, and financial assistance arriving to shore up governments battling communist insurgencies. Globally, the doctrine sent a powerful message. America was positioning itself not merely as a victor of the last war, but as the defender of a global order rooted in democratic ideals and free markets. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, viewed the announcement with suspicion, interpreting it as a declaration of hostility. The ideological divide, already visible in Europe, became sharper, more pronounced, and increasingly unbridgeable. At home, Truman's speech was both celebrated and scrutinized. Legislators debated the extent of American involvement abroad. Journalists speculated on the future of U.S.-Soviet relations, and citizens wondered if the country could maintain peace without risking another war. The Cold War, still in its infancy, had now acquired a clear doctrine, a strategy for engagement, containment, and confrontation that would define global politics for decades. The Truman Doctrine, coupled with the Marshall Plan that would soon follow, marked the United States' definitive step into the ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. It was a declaration not of immediate war, but of long-term vigilance, a commitment to stand firm against the shadows of totalitarianism spreading across the globe. The year was 1945. Europe lay in ruins, a continent scarred by years of brutal conflict. Cities that had once thrummed with life were now reduced to rubble. Streets were strewn with debris, and skeletal buildings cast long shadows across deserted squares. The smell of smoke and destruction lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the war that had consumed millions of lives. Amid this devastation, nations struggled to rebuild. Millions of displaced people wandered across borders, searching for food, shelter, and a sense of safety that seemed increasingly elusive. Yet, even as Europe attempted to heal, a new tension quietly took hold. Two powers, rising from the ashes of victory, began to look at the world and each other with suspicion. The United States, emerging as the planet's preeminent economics and military force, sought stability and the spread of democratic ideals. Its leaders envisioned a world rebuilt on free markets, alliances, and the principles of liberal democracy. Across the continent, the Soviet Union, having endured the unimaginable horrors of the Nazi invasion, emerged with immense human and material losses, yet also with a sense of hard-earned power. Stalin and his inner circle believed that the future security of the USSR depended on creating a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, ensuring that no foreign army could ever again invade Russian soil. In city streets across Berlin, Warsaw, and Prague, the presence of soldiers from both the United States and the Soviet Union was tangible and intimidating. Uniforms of different colors, accents of different languages, and the silent tension between patrols reminded civilians that the war had not truly ended. It had merely transformed. Behind closed doors, diplomats and generals debated the future of a fragile Europe. The Allies had achieved victory, but they were united only by their opposition to the Axis. Now, competing visions for the post-war order began to emerge. While Roosevelt envisioned cooperation, Stalin demanded security and influence, and Churchill feared the spread of Soviet authoritarianism like a creeping shadow across the continent. The world had entered a precarious period. The bullets had stopped flying, but the battles had not. The seeds of the Cold War were quietly being sown amidst the rubble, shadows stretching across cities, borders, and the hearts of nations. In February 1945, the world's fate seemed to hinge on the discussions held at Yalta, a resort city on the Crimean Peninsula. The war in Europe was nearing its end, yet the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, gathered in solemn consultation. The air inside the grand halls was thick with the weight of history. Maps of Europe were spread across tables, showing a continent carved by war and desperate for reconstruction. Every decision carried consequences that would ripple across decades. The leaders debated the division of Germany, the establishment of the United Nations, and the fate of liberated nations. Roosevelt, aging and frail, pressed for a vision of cooperation and post-war stability. Churchill, with his sharp wit and iron will, argued for caution and the containment of Soviet influence. Stalin, determined and unyielding, demanded security for the USSR, asserting control over Eastern Europe as non-negotiable. Behind the dignified facades, tensions simmered. Every handshake, every exchange of documents carried the weight of suspicion. What emerged from Yalta would lay the foundation for the ideological battles to come. The division of Europe into spheres of influence, though framed as pragmatic, would later be seen as the first act in a global chess match between East and West. The world watched as Winston Churchill, the indomitable British leader who had guided his nation through the darkest hours of World War II, took the stage in Fulton, Missouri. In March 1946, the hall was filled with dignitaries, politicians, journalists, and an expectant audience. The war had ended less than a year prior, Yet the threat of conflict lingered not in the form of tanks or battleships, but in the invisible, creeping tension between two superpowers. Churchill spoke with gravitas, his voice carrying the weight of history and the urgency of warning. He described a continent divided, where freedom and tyranny faced off in a silent yet pervasive struggle. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he said, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Europe, though physically free from Nazi occupation, was now politically fractured. Eastern Europe had fallen under the influence of the Soviet Union, with puppet governments installed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond. The Western nations, though victorious, faced an uncertain future. Churchill's words resonated across the Atlantic and beyond. The war had ended, but a new, subtler conflict was beginning. The speech illuminated the ideological divide: democracy versus communism, liberty versus control. It emphasized the reality that the battle lines were no longer drawn on maps of cities and territories, but in the hearts and minds of nations. The Iron Curtain was both literal and metaphorical, a boundary that would dictate political alliances, military strategies, and global diplomacy for decades to come, across Europe. Citizens looked at the world around them with uncertainty. Families divided by shifting borders, economies struggling to recover, and governments reshaped under external influence to the new tension. The Iron Curtain was not just a political concept. It was a looming presence, a shadow, over the hopes of millions who had survived one war only to confront the specter of another. In Washington, the speech reverberated through the corridors of power. The United States recognized the growing challenge. The Soviet Union was no longer a wartime ally, but a potential adversary. Policymakers began to consider strategies of containment, aid, and military readiness. The seeds of what would later be called the Cold War were now firmly planted, and the world stood at the threshold of an era defined by suspicion, preparation, and the ever-present possibility of conflict. The Iron Curtain was drawn not with bricks or mortar, but with ideology, influence, and fear. And as Churchill's words echoed across continents, it became clear the Cold War was not a distant threat. It was already here. In March 1947, the world witnessed a defining moment in the early Cold War. President Harry S. Truman, standing in the Grand Chamber of the United States Congress, addressed a nation still recovering from the devastation of global conflict. The speech he delivered would set the tone for decades of American foreign policy, laying the groundwork for a strategy that sought to contain Soviet influence wherever it threatened freedom. Europe was fragile. Greece teetered on the edge of civil war, its people weary from years of occupation and resistance. Turkey faced pressure from Soviet ambitions in the strategic Dardanelles. Both nations were vulnerable, and Truman recognized that the United States could not afford to remain passive. In his address, he articulated a new principle: the U.S. would provide political, military, and economic assistance to countries resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Support for free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, Truman declared, is the policy of the United States. His words marked a turning point. No longer would America retreat into isolation following the Second World War. Instead, it would actively project its influence, defending democracy as a bulwark against the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine was more than a policy statement. It was a promise. It meant that the United States would commit resources, personnel, and strategic planning to nations under threat, signaling a clear line in the ideological sand. Aid flowed into Greece and Turkey almost immediately, military advisors, supplies, and financial assistance arriving to shore up governments battling communist insurgencies globally. The doctrine sent a powerful message. America was positioning itself not merely as a victor of the last war, but as the defender of a global order rooted in democratic ideals and free markets. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, viewed the announcement with suspicion, interpreting it as a declaration of hostility. The ideological divide, already visible in Europe, became sharper, more pronounced. And increasingly, UNBRIDG, EABLE. At home, Truman's speech was both celebrated and scrutinized. Legislators debated the extent of American involvement abroad. Journalists speculated on the future of U.S.-Soviet relations, and citizens wondered if the country could maintain peace without risking another war. The Cold War, still in its infancy, had now acquired a clear doctrine, a strategy for engagement, containment, and confrontation that would define global politics for decades. The Truman Doctrine, coupled with the Marshall Plan that would soon follow, marked the United States' definitive step into the ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. It was a declaration not of immediate war, but of long-term vigilance, a commitment to stand firm against the shadows of totalitarianism spreading across the globe. As Europe struggled to rebuild from the devastation of World War II, the United States recognized that economic stability was crucial to preventing the spread of communism. Hunger, poverty, and political instability created fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root. In 1948, Secretary of State George C. Marshall introduced a bold plan to rescue Europe from economic collapse and, doing so, fortify it against Soviet influence. The Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, was monumental in both scale and ambition. Billions of dollars in aid, food, machinery, raw materials, and financial support would flow into war-torn nations. Ports, railways, and factories became arteries of hope, delivering essential goods to cities struggling to recover from years of destruction. The effort was not merely charitable, it was strategic. By stabilizing economies and fostering cooperation among European nations, the United States aimed to create a barrier against communist expansion. From London to Paris, Rome to Berlin, Americans arrived with supplies and expertise. Trains carried tons of grain, trucks delivered machinery, and warehouses brimmed with food for populations that had faced famine just months before. European citizens, often wary of foreign intervention, greeted the assistance with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The Soviet Union, however, viewed the Marshall Plan with suspicion. Stalin saw it as a tool of American influence, a method to extend capitalism into the very heart of Europe. Countries within the Soviet sphere were pressured to reject aid, leaving Eastern Europe increasingly isolated and economically constrained. The divide between East and West, already apparent in political speeches and military posturing, became tangible in the flow of goods, technology, and opportunity. The Marshall Plan was more than an economic program. It was a statement of intent. The United States was committing not only to European recovery, but also to the containment of communism through strength, stability, and prosperity. By revitalizing Western Europe, America was creating a bulwark against Soviet expansion, demonstrating that wealth, freedom, and democracy could offer an alternative to authoritarian control. Over the next few years, the Marshall Plan would prove transformative. Cities rose from ruins, factories resumed production, and millions of Europeans found hope and opportunity. Politically, it solidified alliances, laying the groundwork for NATO and a united Western Front against the growing Soviet challenge. In the shadow of nuclear weapons and ideological struggle, economic power became a weapon in its own right, a force that could shape nations and influence the course of history without firing a single shot. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States illuminated a fundamental truth of the Cold War. Power was measured not only in armies and missiles, but in the ability to nurture, rebuild, and inspire. The battle for hearts and minds had begun, and Europe was the first theater where prosperity and ideology would clash in the shadow of an emerging global rivalry. By 1948. the tension between East and West had escalated to a critical flashpoint. Berlin, a city deep within Soviet-controlled territory, became the epicenter of the emerging Cold War. The Soviets, seeking to consolidate control over the entire city and challenge the influence of the Western Allies, initiated a blockade. Roads, railways, and canals connecting West Berlin to the outside world were cut off. Fuel, food, and essential supplies could no longer reach the 2 million residents of the city's western sectors. The streets of West Berlin quickly filled with fear and uncertainty. Families rationed food, hospitals struggled to provide care, and morale wavered under the strain of isolation. The blockade was not just a physical barrier. It was a psychological weapon, a test of resolve by a superpower willing to flex its muscles in pursuit of dominance. The response from the United States and its allies was swift and innovative. General Lucius Clay, the military governor of the American sector, proposed an audacious plan, the Berlin Airlift. Hundreds of cargo planes would fly round-the-clock missions, delivering essential supplies across the skies to sustain the city. Each flight carried tons of food, coal, and medicine, creating a lifeline that defied the Soviet attempt at control. From dawn until dusk, aircraft took off and landed in precise formations, their engines roaring across the skies of Berlin. Pilots navigated through clouds, fog, and winter storms, risking their lives to keep a city alive. Western airfields became hubs of ceaseless activity, with ground crews working tirelessly to ensure planes were loaded, fueled, and dispatched. Without delay, the world watched in awe. Images of aircrews waving to grateful Berliners, children receiving food packages, and planes gliding across the gray skies became symbols of determination and ingenuity. The blockade, intended to force the West into submission, instead showcased the resolve and resourcefulness of the Allies. After nearly a year of relentless effort, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade in May 1949. West Berlin had survived, a testament to the power of strategic planning, international cooperation, and unyielding resolve. The Berlin Airlift became a defining episode of the early Cold War, demonstrating that confrontation between superpowers could be managed, that the world's future would be shaped not only by weapons but by creativity, courage, and the will to persevere. The blockade left an indelible mark on the Cold War. It highlighted the stakes of ideological confrontation, reinforced the divide between East and West, and set a precedent for the conflicts and crises that would dominate the coming decades. In the skies over Berlin, the battle for influence had been fought without firing a shot. Yet the victory resonated around the globe. The post-war years had revealed a world divided. While the United States and its allies sought to rebuild and secure democratic institutions, the Soviet Union tightened its grip over Eastern Europe. By 1949, it became increasingly clear that Europe needed a formal alliance to ensure its defense and stability. This realization led to the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO, a military alliance designed to deter Soviet aggression and maintain peace in the West. On April 4, 1949, 12 nations, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The agreement was revolutionary. It established that an armed attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. Collective defense became the cornerstone of Western security, an unbreakable promise forged in the shadow of recent war. The formation of NATO sent a clear and unambiguous message. The United States, once hesitant to involve itself in European affairs beyond aid and reconstruction, was now committed to permanent military engagement. Soviet leaders, already wary of American influence, saw the alliance as a direct challenge of formalized Western bloc encircling Eastern Europe. The ideological and strategic lines were now unmistakably drawn. Military planners began coordinating strategies, sharing intelligence, and establishing bases across member nations. Troop deployments and exercises were designed to signal strength and readiness. Europe's reconstruction was no longer just an economic endeavor. It had become a geopolitical struggle, where armies and alliances served as the ultimate deterrent against the ambitions of a rival superpower. NATO was more than a military pact. It was a statement of values. It represented the shared commitment of free nations to defend liberty, democracy, and human rights. It reinforced the principle that security was not only a national concern, but a collective responsibility. As the Soviet Union watched and responded with its own Warsaw Pact in later years, the world entered a period of unprecedented tension and caution. The Cold War, once a series of isolated disputes and ideological warnings, had now crystallized into a structured standoff. NATO's creation marked a turning point, solidifying alliances that would endure for decades and shaping the geopolitical chessboard on which the United States and the Soviet Union would maneuver in the years to come. Europe, still scarred from war, now faced a new reality. The threat of conflict had shifted from the battlefields to the corridors of diplomacy, the skies of reconnaissance, and the hidden laboratories of military research. The formation of NATO was a reminder that in the emerging Cold War, preparation, unity, and vigilance were the keys to survival. In September 1949, the world's balance of power shifted dramatically. After years of intense research, secrecy, and espionage, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, codenamed RDS-1, at a remote testing site in the Kazakh steppe. The detonation sent a mushroom cloud soaring into the sky, a stark signal that the United States no longer held a monopoly on nuclear weaponry. For American leaders, the news was alarming. The shock of Soviet capability forced a reevaluation of military strategy and global posture. The fear that had long lingered in the corridors of power, the possibility of a nuclear confrontation, was now real. The Cold War was no longer a conflict defined solely by ideology, diplomacy, or regional skirmishes. It had entered a dangerous new phase where mutual destruction became a tangible threat. The test itself was a marvel of science and secrecy. Soviet scientists, working under immense pressure and political scrutiny, had reverse-engineered knowledge obtained from both indigenous research and espionage networks. The successful detonation represented not only technical achievement, but also the culmination of an intense, clandestine race that had captivated both superpowers. Across the globe, governments and citizens alike grappled with the implications. Headlines screamed warnings of a new nuclear era, and cities began to understand that the shadow of atomic weapons loomed over every decision. Military planners scrambled to develop strategies for deterrence. Civil defense programs were expanded, and the concept of mutual assured destruction slowly entered the consciousness of policymakers. The psychological impact was profound. Ordinary citizens lived under the constant knowledge that the world's two dominant powers now had the ability to annihilate each other and potentially the planet in a single moment of miscalculation or conflict. Fallout shelters were constructed, drills practiced, and the imagination of fear permeated culture, literature, and cinema. Politically, the Soviet atomic bomb altered negotiations and alliances. The United States, determined to maintain its strategic edge, accelerated its own nuclear program and refined delivery systems, while simultaneously seeking ways to strengthen Western Europe's defenses through NATO. The Soviet Union, emboldened by its newfound power, solidified control over Eastern Europe, confident that nuclear capability could deter Western intervention. The detonation of the Soviet atomic bomb was more than a military milestone. It was a turning point in the Cold War. The conflict had evolved from ideological rivalry into a high-stakes game of global brinkmanship, where diplomacy, espionage, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation would define the tense decades to come. The shadow of nuclear weapons now stretched across continents, shaping policy, perception, and the precarious balance of peace. In June 1950. The fragile peace of the post-war world was shattered on the Korean Peninsula. North Korean forces, equipped and backed by the Soviet Union, crossed the 38th parallel in a sudden and forceful invasion of South Korea. Tanks rumbled across the terrain, artillery fired into cities, and the sound of gunfire echoed through villages and towns. The world was once again drawn into conflict, but this time it was a proxy war, a test of influence between the two emerging superpowers of the Cold War. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, responded swiftly. President Truman authorized military intervention to defend South Korea, framing the conflict as a crucial stand against communist expansion. The Korean War was not only a fight for territory, it was a struggle to maintain credibility in the global balance of power. The outcome in Korea would signal to allies and adversaries alike whether the U.S. would honor its commitments to contain communism. The battles were brutal and relentless. North Korean troops initially swept through the South with overwhelming force, capturing Seoul and pushing South Korean and UN forces into a desperate defensive perimeter around the port city of Busan. The mountainous terrain, harsh weather, and logistical challenges tested soldiers on both sides as commanders grappled with strategy, supply lines, and the constant threat of encirclement. In response, General Douglas MacArthur orchestrated a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, a maneuver that stunned the North Korean army and turned the tide of the war. UN forces advanced, recapturing Seoul and moving deep into North Korea. Yet, as American and Allied troops approached the Yalu River, the border with China, a new complication emerged. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer soldiers crossed into Korea, launching massive counterattacks that forced a grueling stalemate. The Korean War revealed the complex dynamics of the Cold War. It was not merely a local or regional conflict. It was a global contest of ideology, strategy, and influence. The Soviet Union provided material support, intelligence, and guidance to the North, while the United States led a coalition defending the South. The battlefield became a proving ground for weapons, tactics, and the emerging concept of limited war under the shadow of nuclear threat. Civilians bore the brunt of the fighting. Cities were leveled, families displaced, and millions of lives lost or forever changed. Refugees streamed across borders seeking safety from the relentless violence. The war was a stark reminder that ideological rivalry often came at an unimaginable human cost, and that in the Cold War, the consequences of superpower confrontation were rarely contained to military forces alone. By 1953, an armistice was reached, and the border was effectively restored near the 38th parallel. Korea remained divided, a physical embodiment of the global ideological struggle. The conflict had set a precedent. In the Cold War, proxy wars would become a recurring feature, where local battles carried the weight of global confrontation, and where every engagement was a test of resolve, credibility, and strategic patience. The Korean War had confirmed a sobering reality. The Cold War was not cold in its consequences. While direct confrontation between the superpowers had been avoided, the shadow of violence, nuclear threat, and ideological struggle loomed large, shaping military and diplomatic policy for decades to come. While American soldiers fought on distant battlefields in Korea, fear was spreading across the United States itself. The Cold War was not only waged abroad, it had seeped into the very fabric of American society. This was the era of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, a time when suspicion and paranoia permeated everyday life. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a rising political figure, seized upon the nation's fear of communist infiltration with fiery speeches and lists of alleged communist sympathizers. He painted a picture of a nation under siege from within. Government agencies, Hollywood studios, universities, and even labor unions came under scrutiny. Accusations often lacked evidence, yet the weight of public fear made even unproven claims dangerous. Careers were destroyed, reputations tarnished, and a culture of silence and self-censorship took hold. The fear was palpable. Ordinary citizens worried that friends, neighbors, or even family members might secretly be loyal to Moscow. Schools taught children about the perils of communism. Newspapers and radio programs amplified the message, reinforcing the narrative that the Soviet threat was omnipresent, not only overseas, but also inside American homes. The Red Scare extended beyond politics. It affected art, entertainment, and academia. Writers, actors, and musicians faced blacklists, their work suppressed simply for suspected leftist sympathies. Universities scrutinized professors, and intellectual discourse was stifled. As questioning or dissent could be construed as dangerous or unpatriotic, however, McCarthyism also sparked a countercurrent. Courageous journalists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens began to challenge the climate of fear. Investigative reporting and legal battles exposed the excesses of McCarthy's campaign, ultimately leading to his censure by the Senate in 1954. Yet the social and cultural scars remained. Families and communities had been torn apart, and the lesson of McCarthyism lingered in times of ideological confrontation. Fear can be as potent and destructive as any army. McCarthyism illustrated a crucial Cold War truth. The battle against communism was fought not only in foreign lands, but also within the minds, institutions, and daily lives of ordinary citizens. In the United States, suspicion became a weapon. And the ideological war took a deeply personal turn, leaving long-lasting effects on American politics, culture, and society. This domestic struggle mirrored global tensions as the superpowers maneuvered for influence abroad. Fear and mistrust shaped the policies, priorities, and perceptions of people at home, making the Cold War a total war of ideology, psychology, and diplomacy. As the Korean War raged, a more ominous struggle was unfolding behind closed doors: the nuclear arms race. The United States, determined to maintain its strategic advantage, pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering to create a weapon far more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. This weapon was the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, a thermonuclear device capable of destroying entire cities in a single detonation. In 1952, the United States successfully tested its first hydrogen bomb at Eniwak Atoll in the Pacific. The explosion dwarfed any previous atomic test, sending shockwaves both literal and figurative across the globe. The sheer magnitude of its destructive power was unprecedented. Cities could now be annihilated with a single strike, and the concept of total nuclear war entered the strategic vocabulary of policymakers and military planners. The Soviet Union, unwilling to be left behind, accelerated its own program. By 1953, the USSR had detonated its own hydrogen bomb, signaling that the era of nuclear parity and potential mutual destruction had begun. The Cold War was no longer merely a contest of armies or ideologies. It had escalated into a high-stakes contest of annihilation potential. The arms race extended far beyond bombs. Delivery systems became crucial. Long-range bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles emerged as the primary means to ensure retaliation capability. Both superpowers embraced the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. MAD. A grim but effective strategy. The certainty that any nuclear attack would provoke an overwhelming retaliatory strike deterred direct conflict, yet kept the world perpetually on edge. This nuclear escalation transformed geopolitics. Alliances solidified, military budgets soared, and scientific research shifted toward weaponization and detection technologies. Civil defense programs expanded in the United States, with schools practicing duck-and-cover drills and families constructing fallout shelters in anticipation of a possible nuclear strike. Culturally, the shadow of the H-bomb seeped into literature, film, art. Writers imagined post-apocalyptic landscapes, while films depicted the horrifying consequences of atomic warfare. The ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation became a defining feature of everyday life, shaping public consciousness and influencing government policy for decades. The birth of the hydrogen bomb marked a pivotal moment in the Cold War. It was a reminder that the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was no longer limited to proxy wars or ideological competition. The stakes had become existential, and the world would never be the same. Every political negotiation, every military maneuver, and every intelligence operation now occurred under the looming shadow of unparalleled destructive capability. The Cold War was no longer confined to Earth. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the planet. Its beeping signals transmitted across the globe marked not just a technological achievement, but a profound psychological victory for Moscow. The United States, once confident in its scientific supremacy, suddenly felt vulnerable. If the Soviets could place a satellite in orbit, could they also deliver nuclear warheads from space? The launch of Sputnik ignited the space race, a high-stakes contest for technological dominance and ideological prestige. Space exploration became a proxy battlefield where innovation, propaganda, and national pride collided. In Washington, panic and urgency swept through Congress and the military. Investments in science and engineering skyrocketed, leading to the creation of new institutions, including the National Aeronautics and Space Administration (NASA) in 1958. The competition extended beyond satellites. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to achieve increasingly audacious milestones: first human in space, first spacewalk, and ultimately, the first manned moon landing. Each achievement was celebrated not only for its scientific merit, but as evidence of ideological superiority. The world watched every launch and mission through the lens of the Cold War, with every success or failure interpreted as a reflection of a nation's strength, intelligence, and technological capability. Education and research were transformed. Schools emphasized mathematics, physics, and engineering to cultivate a generation capable of meeting the demands of space exploration and national defense. Universities became hotbeds of innovation, while government-funded research accelerated. Developments in rocketry, telecommunications, and computing. The space race was also a symbol of human ambition and imagination. For the first time, the stars were not merely distant objects, but arenas for geopolitical struggle. Satellites enabled global surveillance, communications, and reconnaissance, giving each superpower unprecedented strategic capabilities. The outer space frontier had become a critical component of Cold War strategy, shaping military planning, diplomacy, and the very perception of power on Earth. Sputnik and the ensuing space achievements demonstrated that the Cold War was not just fought with armies or nuclear arsenals. It was also a competition of minds, creativity, and technological might. The world had entered an era where who controlled the heavens could wield influence over the planet below, and the race to the stars became inseparable from the struggle for global dominance. October 1962 brought the Cold War to its most perilous moment. For 13 tense days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. In response to American missiles in Turkey and to bolster the regime of Fidel Castro, when American reconnaissance planes discovered the missile, Cites President John F. Kennedy faced an agonizing decision. A direct military strike risked full-scale nuclear war. Yet inaction could undermine U.S. credibility and leave the nation vulnerable. Kennedy and his advisors debated every option, from airstrikes to a full invasion of Cuba. Ultimately, they settled on a naval blockade or quarantine. To prevent further Soviet shipments of missiles to the island, the world watched as the standoff unfolded, though most of the public remained unaware of the imminent threat. Behind closed doors, tense negotiations between Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev determined the fate of millions. Each day carried the potential for catastrophic miscalculation. A single misinterpreted move could trigger global nuclear devastation. After intense diplomatic exchanges and secret back-channel communications, a resolution emerged. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, while the United States secretly promised to withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. The crisis ended, but the lessons were profound. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated the terrifying reality of nuclear brinkmanship. It revealed how close human civilization had come to destruction and underscored the importance of communication, diplomacy, and measured restraint. Both superpowers recognized that future confrontations required better crisis management and direct communication, leading to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct line between the leaders. To prevent miscalculations, the crisis left an indelible mark on global politics. It reshaped U.S. foreign policy, strengthened alliances, and instilled a lasting sense of caution in nuclear strategy. Most importantly, it forced the world to confront a stark truth in the nuclear age. The stakes of the Cold War were existential, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. Asterisk. While the world watched the superpowers jockey for nuclear supremacy, the Cold War was also fought in the shadows of far-off battlefields. One of the most devastating theaters was Vietnam, where ideological conflict erupted into a brutal proxy war. The United States, determined to contain communism, supported South Vietnam, while the Soviet Union and China backed the Communist North. Vietnam became a crucible for Cold War tensions. The U.S. deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, relying on advanced technology, air power, and chemical defoliants in an attempt to suppress the insurgency. Yet the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, driven by nationalism and ideological commitment, adapted with guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and intricate networks of tunnels. The war tested not only military strategies, but also the moral and psychological limits of both nations. Graphic images of combat, civilian casualties, and the horrors of napalm and Agent Orange were broadcast worldwide, sparking a powerful anti-war movement and exposing the grim human cost of superpower rivalry. For the Soviet Union, Vietnam was an opportunity to extend influence without risking direct confrontation with the United States. Arms, advisors, and logistical support allowed Moscow to shape outcomes in Southeast Asia while avoiding full-scale conflict. Similarly, China provided support, emphasizing ideological solidarity and regional ambitions. Vietnam also demonstrated the limitations of conventional military power in ideological conflicts. The U.S., despite overwhelming firepower, faced persistent resistance and political controversy at home, leading to a crisis of confidence in government and military leadership. The war became a symbol of the Cold War's human toll, illustrating that victory in ideological struggles often came at immense cost. By the war's end in 1975, North Vietnam achieved its goal of unifying the country under communism, marking a setback for American foreign policy. The conflict left deep scars on the region and reshaped global perceptions of superpower influence. Vietnam became a stark reminder that the Cold War was fought not only with nuclear arsenals and political maneuvering, but also through proxy wars that touched the lives of millions around the world. By the late 1960s, the relentless pressures of the Cold War had left both the United States and the Soviet Union seeking ways to reduce direct confrontation. Enter détente, a period of cautious diplomacy, arms control, negotiations, and temporary easing of hostilities for the United States. Détente offered the chance to manage Soviet competition without escalating military conflicts, particularly after the costly Vietnam War. For the Soviet Union, it allowed consolidation of influence abroad and the opportunity to secure economic and technological gains from engagement with the West. The era saw a series of groundbreaking agreements. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks SALT-I in 1972 set limits on nuclear missile deployment, establishing a framework for arms control that would influence future negotiations. Leaders like President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev engaged in historic visits, symbolizing a willingness to cooperate even amid deep ideological differences. Trade, cultural exchanges, and scientific collaborations became tools to reduce tension. American companies explored Soviet markets, while Soviet scientists and athletes visited the West, building connections that transcended the rigid boundaries of Cold War rivalry. Yet détente was fragile. Beneath the surface, the superpowers continued to compete in less visible arenas: proxy conflicts, espionage, and technological races. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and ongoing support for revolutionary movements reminded the world that underlying tensions had not disappeared. Détente, though a moment of cautious optimism, highlighted the delicate balance required to maintain peace in a nuclear world. The period also demonstrated that diplomacy could coexist with rivalry, creating space for dialogue and limited cooperation. Détente left a mixed legacy. It slowed the pace of confrontation but never eliminated the fundamental ideological struggle, setting the stage for renewed tensions in the 1980s. The fragile calm of détente was shattered in December 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a faltering communist government facing internal insurgency. This military intervention reignited Cold War tensions, drawing the United States into another high-stakes confrontation for the Soviet Union. The invasion was framed as a necessary step to protect a fellow socialist state and maintain influence in a strategically important region. But the move quickly became a quagmire. Afghan resistance, comprised of mujahideen fighters supported by tribal networks, foreign volunteers, and covert U.S. aid, created a prolonged and costly conflict. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter and later Ronald Reagan, saw the invasion as an opportunity to counter Soviet expansion without direct confrontation. Through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, the U.S. funneled weapons, training, and funding to Afghan fighters, turning the rugged mountains of Afghanistan into a proxy battlefield for Cold War rivalry. This period also intensified the arms race, with the Reagan administration dramatically increasing U.S. defense spending, deploying new nuclear weapons, and pursuing advanced military technologies. The Soviet economy, already strained by internal inefficiencies, struggled to sustain its military commitments abroad. Afghanistan became emblematic of the human cost of Cold War proxy wars. Millions of Afghans were displaced, casualties mounted, and the region was destabilized for decades. Internationally, the invasion prompted widespread condemnation and boycotts, including the U.S.-led boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Ultimately, the Soviet-Afghan War accelerated the erosion of Soviet power and contributed to internal pressures that would later catalyze reform and the eventual collapse of the USSR. It was a vivid reminder that the Cold War's ideological struggle often played out in distant lands, leaving lasting scars while testing the limits of global superpower influence. Asterisk. The 1980s ushered in a renewed period of Cold War intensity with the election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1980. Reagan, a staunch anti-communist, viewed the Soviet Union as an evil empire and sought to confront it with a combination of military strength and ideological resolve. Under his administration, the United States dramatically expanded defense spending, modernized its nuclear arsenal, and deployed intermediate-range missiles in Europe, escalating tensions with Moscow. Reagan's policies emphasized both deterrence and confrontation, signaling that the U.S. would not shrink from challenging Soviet influence worldwide. Perhaps the most ambitious and controversial initiative was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, often dubbed Star Wars. This proposed missile defense system aimed to protect the United States from nuclear attack by intercepting incoming missiles with advanced technology. Though largely untested and criticized as impractical, SDI intensified pressure on the already struggling Soviet economy, forcing Moscow to allocate vast resources to counter the perceived threat. Simultaneously, the United States continued to support anti-Soviet movements around the globe, including the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and anti-communist forces in Central America. These efforts reinforced the global ideological struggle, positioning the U.S. as a proactive defender of democracy and freedom against communist expansion. Yet, beneath the rhetoric and military buildup, subtle channels of diplomacy began to emerge. Reagan engaged in a series of high-profile summits with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, including the 1985 Geneva Summit and the 1987 Reykjavik Summit, which opened the door to arms reduction discussions and eventual treaties. By the late 1980s, the combined pressures of internal economic weakness, reformist policies under Gorbachev, and the mounting unsustainability of global confrontation signaled that the Cold War's end might be within reach. The Reagan era demonstrated that the Cold War could intensify dramatically, yet still evolve toward dialogue and eventual resolution. Asterisk. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was grappling with profound economic stagnation, political rigidity, and societal dissatisfaction. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, a dynamic leader who recognized that the USSR needed bold reforms to survive. His twin policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness marked a dramatic departure from the rigid orthodoxy of previous decades. Perestroika sought to revitalize the Soviet economy by introducing limited market mechanisms, encouraging private enterprise, and improving efficiency in state industries. Glasnost, on the other hand, aimed to foster transparency, freedom of expression, and political accountability, allowing citizens to openly critique the government and participate in public debate. These reforms had far-reaching implications for the Cold War. For the first time, the Soviet leadership signaled a willingness to engage constructively with the West, reduce confrontation, and participate in arms control negotiations. Internationally, Gorbachev's approach was a stark contrast to the previous decades of uncompromising Soviet foreign policy. Yet, these reforms also exposed the deep fissures within Soviet society. Economic instability, rising nationalism in various republics, and demands for greater autonomy challenged the cohesion of the USSR in Eastern Europe. Countries long under Soviet influence, such as Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, began to push for political change. Emboldened by Moscow's new stance, Gorbachev's reforms ultimately reshaped the Cold War landscape, demonstrating that the conflict was not only fought with weapons and ideology, but could also be influenced by leadership, diplomacy, and societal transformation. The stage was set for a historic unraveling, as the Soviet Union faced both internal challenges and unprecedented opportunities for peace. Asterisk. The year 1989 became a turning point in the Cold War. marked by a wave of revolutionary change sweeping across Eastern Europe. Central to this transformation was the fall of the Berlin Wall, a symbol of division and oppression for nearly 3 decades. The wall, erected in 1961, had physically and ideologically separated East and West Berlin, embodying the broader clash between communist and capitalist systems. By the late 1980s, however, mounting pressure from pro-democracy movements, economic stagnation, and Gorbachev's reformist policies weakened the grip of communist regimes. In November 1989, after weeks of protests and growing public demand for freedom of movement, East German authorities announced that citizens could cross into West Berlin. Crowds swarmed the checkpoints, chipping away at the wall with hammers and chisels, jubilantly celebrating a moment once thought impossible. Television images of the wall's destruction broadcast around the world, symbolizing the imminent collapse of the Eastern Bloc. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments rapidly fell. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania witnessed peaceful or, in some cases, tumultuous transitions toward democracy. These events highlighted the fragility of authoritarian regimes and the powerful force of popular movements in shaping history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a physical dismantling of concrete and barbed wire. It represented the collapse of ideological division in Europe. It marked a decisive step toward the end of the Cold War, proving that decades of tension could ultimately yield to the aspirations of ordinary people yearning for freedom. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union faced a cascade of crises that would culminate in its dissolution. Gorbachev's reforms, while intended to strengthen the USSR, had inadvertently unleashed forces beyond his control. Rising nationalist movements within the republic's economic collapse and political fragmentation eroded central authority. In August 1991, a hardline coup attempted to reverse Gorbachev's policies, temporarily detaining him and declaring a state of emergency. The coup failed, largely due to popular resistance and the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, whose defiance from atop a tank became an iconic symbol of resistance to authoritarianism. By December, the momentum toward independence was unstoppable. Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics formally declared their sovereignty, effectively dismantling the Soviet Union. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president, signaling the official end of the USSR. The Cold War, a conflict that had defined global politics for nearly half a century, had finally come to a close. The dissolution of the Soviet Union transformed the geopolitical landscape. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, while former Soviet republics embarked on uncertain paths of nation-building and reform. The ideological confrontation that had fueled proxy wars, nuclear brinkmanship, and global tension was over, but its legacy continued to shape international relations, security policies, and collective memory for generations to come. The world had survived the shadow of nuclear conflict, but the Cold War's lessons about ideology, diplomacy, and the perils of unchecked power remained profoundly relevant. Even after the Cold War officially ended, its shadows continued to shape the world. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism left deep imprints on global politics, military strategies, and international relations. Former adversaries, once locked in a deadly standoff, began cautious cooperation. Yet mutual suspicion lingered. The Cold War had accelerated technological and scientific advancements, particularly in space exploration and military technology. The space race had put humans on the moon, while nuclear research had created a delicate balance of terror that demanded unprecedented levels of diplomacy and restraint. Culturally, the era influenced literature, film, and art. Spy novels, Cold War thrillers and dystopian fiction reflected the anxieties of the time, while propaganda had shaped generations' perceptions of the enemy. The conflict also spurred human rights movements and political activism. As populations around the world sought freedom from authoritarian rule, the economic and political transformations in Eastern Europe and former Soviet states demonstrated the power of reform and resilience. Meanwhile, the United States, emerging as the sole superpower, faced new responsibilities on the global stage. Navigating uncharted post-Cold War challenges, the Cold War's legacy serves as a reminder that diplomacy, vigilance, and communication are crucial to preventing catastrophe. It was a time when the world balanced on the knife edge of nuclear annihilation, yet also a period that inspired innovation, courage, and the enduring hope for peace. History would remember the Cold War not only for its confrontations and crises, but also for the human spirit that survived its shadows and the lessons it left for future generations. The Cold War stands as one of the most defining periods of the 20th century, a testament to human ingenuity, fear, and resilience. Its story is not only about superpowers and nuclear arsenals, but also about the countless individuals whose lives were shaped by its tensions. From leaders making life-or-death decisions to ordinary citizens living under the constant shadow of conflict, one of the Cold War's greatest lessons is the importance of diplomacy and dialogue. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 showed that even in moments of extreme peril, negotiation and restraint can prevent catastrophe. It reminded the world that unchecked aggression and miscommunication could have irreversible consequences. The era also highlights the danger of theological rigidity. By defining friend and foe in absolute terms, both sides fueled proxy wars, fueled distrust, and often overlooked the shared humanity of those caught in the middle. The collapse of the Soviet Union demonstrated that no system, no matter how powerful, is immune to the forces of change, reform, and public will. Technological and scientific achievements of the period, space exploration, nuclear energy, and computing illustrate how competition can drive innovation, yet they also underscore the ethical responsibilities accompanying great power. The balance of power, the principle of deterrence, and the frameworks of international law established during the Cold War continue to influence global security policies today. Ultimately, the Cold War reminds humanity that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the result of vigilance, cooperation, and understanding. It is a chapter of history filled with tension, triumph, and tragedy, whose lessons endure as cautionary tales and guiding principles for a world still navigating the complexities of power and diplomacy. The echoes of the Cold War remain, not as relics of fear, but as enduring lessons in leadership, resilience, and the pursuit of a more stable and just world. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Cold War became history, but its impact continued to ripple across the globe. Countries once aligned under rigid ideological banners now navigated a world of new alliances, economic globalization, and emerging threats. Former enemies became trading partners, yet memories of past conflicts remained vivid in politics, culture, and collective consciousness. The nuclear arsenals that had once threatened annihilation were reduced, but the shadow of mutually assured destruction lingered, a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for both creation and devastation. Lessons from the Cold War informed new international agreements, treaties, and peacekeeping missions, shaping a framework for a more secure global order. The world learned that power must be tempered with prudence, that dialogue can avert disaster, and that innovation must be guided by responsibility. History also showed that the human spirit can endure extreme pressure, adapt, and ultimately strive for progress, even amidst fear and uncertainty. In reflecting on the Cold War, we see a story of contrast, fear and hope, tension and collaboration, conflict, and reconciliation. It is a story that underscores the importance of understanding, compromise, and the relentless pursuit of peace in an unpredictable world. Though the Cold War has ended, its lessons remain alive, guiding leaders, citizens, and generations yet to come in, navigating the delicate balance between power and peace. The Cold War was more than a geopolitical struggle. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's fears, ambitions, and contradictions. It demonstrated the incredible heights of technological achievement and the terrifying potential of human error. It taught us that the fate of millions can hinge on the decisions of a few, and that vigilance, communication, and empathy are essential in a world armed with unprecedented power. The era left behind monuments, literature, films, and lessons that continue to shape our understanding of diplomacy, conflict, and resilience. As we remember the Cold War, we are reminded that history is not just about wars fought or treaties signed. It is about the people who lived through it, the leaders who navigated it, and the societies that emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between fear and hope. By studying this period, we honor those who endured its trials and embrace the lessons it offers, ensuring that the shadows of the Cold War served not as a warning of inevitable doom, but as a guide toward a more thoughtful, peaceful, and cooperative future.